Let me call the hearing to order. Let me thank Ranking Member Graham, our colleagues on this committee, and our witnesses for being with us this morning. In my view, we are living through a pivotal moment, not only in the history of our country, not only in the history of the global community, but in the history of humanity. When we talk about our responsibilities as human beings, as parents and as grandparents, there is nothing more important than leaving this country and the entire planet healthy and habitable for our kids, grandkids, and future generations. This is a moral responsibility that we cannot shirk. So today, let us be clear. The debate is over. The scientific community has spoken in a virtually unanimous voice. Climate change is real. It is caused by human activity and is already causing devastating damage to our country and throughout the world. The scientists have told us that we as a global community have less than a decade, fewer than 10 years, to act boldly to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energies, or our entire planet will face irreparable harm. If we do not get our act together, we will see more devastating and extreme heat. We will see more floods, more rising sea levels, more extreme weather disturbances, more ocean acidification, more drought, more famine, more disease, and more human suffering. Now, I have heard from some of my colleagues and some very powerful special interests that the cost of combating climate change is expensive. And that's true, they're right. But my response is, compared to what? So let's be clear. The cost of inaction, of not combating climate change, will be far, far more expensive in every way than transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel. The economists have estimated that the cost of not acting on climate change will total some $34 trillion in the United States alone in lost economic activity, and more than 100 trillion throughout the world by the end of the century. And if you're not worried about the financial costs, the scientists have told us that the cost of climate inaction may put the entire planet and life as we know it in serious jeopardy. In fact, if we do nothing, the effects of climate change will lead to the deaths of 1.5 million people across the globe every single year from factors such as malnutrition, heat stress, and tropical diseases such as malaria. If we do nothing, the effects of air pollution in the United States will lead to the deaths of almost 300,000 Americans between now and the year 2030. If we do nothing, the effects of climate change will throw over 100 million people throughout the world into extreme poverty. If we do nothing, the World Bank has told us that the effects of climate change could result in the mass migration and displacement of more than 140 million people in Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and other locations by the year 2050. And when millions of people migrate, no one doubts that international tensions rise and the likelihood of armed conflict increases. While some of my colleagues may still refer to climate change as a hoax, let us be clear. This so-called hoax threatens to destroy our food and water supply, flood our cities and towns, and displace millions of people from their homes. Let's talk for a moment about rising sea levels. What the scientists have told us is that unless we reverse course major portions of New York City, London, and Hong Kong are at risk of chronic flooding by the end of the century, while cities like Miami, New Orleans, and Atlantic City could be inundated by severe flooding much sooner. Let's talk about extreme heat. Last year was tied for the warmest year on record, and all of the 10 warmest years in recorded history have occurred since 2005. The Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, has found that extreme heat events, quote, are the most prominent cause of weather-related human mortality in the U.S., responsible for more deaths annually than hurricanes, lightning, tornadoes, floods, and earthquakes combined, end of quote. Let's talk about extreme weather disturbances. Last year, we had the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record. Further, over the past 5 years, major natural disasters caused more than $615 billion in damage and nearly 4,000 deaths. Let's talk about wildfires. Last year was one of the worst U.S. wildfire seasons in recorded history, and the 3 worst U.S. wildfire seasons in terms of acres burned have occurred over the last 6 years. Scientists tell us that these fires are getting bigger and more severe because of climate change. In my view, we have a fundamental choice to make. We can listen to the fossil fuel industry and climate deniers and not worry about the impact of climate change. Or we can listen to the scientists who tell us that we have got to act boldly and aggressively to prevent a climate catastrophe. In my view, we have spent far too long and wasted too much time discussing whether or not climate change is real. This debate was not driven by science, but by a decades-long campaign of lies, distortion, and deceit funded by the fossil fuel industry. Oil companies knew by the late 1970s that the emissions from their products were causing irreparable harm to the planet. Back in the 1970s, they knew that. And yet, instead of working to solve or even acknowledge the problem, they followed the campaign plan designed by Big Tobacco to make sure our government remained inactive in terms of combating this global crisis. In the end, sadly, history is likely to judge the actions of the CEOs of fossil fuel companies as causing more death and more human misery than the tobacco industry, and that is quite a legacy. And let us also understand something extremely important, not widely known, and that is despite all of the discussions about climate change that we have, unbelievably, we are continuing today down the same path. Over the next 10 years, fossil fuel activity in the United States is on track to account for 60% of the global growth in oil and gas production. In 2019, the United States was the world's second largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Our emissions per capita were 77% higher than China, which was the largest emitter, and 85% higher than the European Union. That is not sustainable. In my view, we've got to make it clear to the fossil fuel industry that their short-term profits are not more important than the future of our planet. At this hearing, we will explore the cost climate change has had and will have on our planet. Among many other actions that must be taken, we cannot continue to hand out corporate welfare to the fossil fuel industry. And that is why today I, along with Senators Merkley, Markey, Booker, Van Hollen, and Warren, introduced the End Polluter Welfare Act, which would abolish $150 billion in tax loopholes, subsidies, and special interest giveaways to the oil, gas, and coal industry over the next decade. The devastating impacts of climate change are here, and now is the time for Congress to take action. As it happens, I invited the CEOs of Exxon, BP, and Chevron to testify today and tell their side of the story. All 3 declined. but I am pleased that we have an excellent panel of witnesses who will discuss the cost of climate change and what taxpayers can do about it. And now let me turn the mic over to Ranking Member Graham for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I look forward to the testimony today. I'll just speak for myself here. I've come to conclude that climate change is real, that human emissions create greenhouse gas effect that traps heat, and that you see a rise in the oceans and acidity in the water and droughts and disruption of weather patterns. That makes sense to me. I've been to Norway with Senator McCain, Greenland, I think, with Senator McCain and Senator Clinton at the time, and Alaska. The native people in those regions have seen a dramatic change. So count me in on the idea that the science is real. The solutions, I think, are becoming more obvious to me. There are three areas of carbon emissions, basically, in our lives: transportation, power production, and living, homes and offices. So we have some folks from Johnson & Johnson are going to tell us about how we can lower emissions through energy efficiency, that we can have toasters and thermostats and every kind of device we use daily can be more energy efficient, lowering the cost to consumer and lowering demand on production. Count me in for that. Weatherizing buildings, having the buildings of the future, maybe have solar panels on top of our houses. It's just endless opportunities in the office space, consumer utilization, and home living that would be a win for the climate, for the environment, as well as the consumer in terms of lowering cost. It's taken an investment, but I think it'd be an investment worth making. On power production, wind and solar's footprint is getting bigger. There are all kind of new technologies coming on board that are clean in nature. I think natural gas is a bridge fuel. I think natural gas has a lower component. To our friends in the coal world, I met a gentleman a couple of days ago who believes that coal can be transformed, not burned, to create a product that will go into electric vehicles, batteries. So I'm trying to make this, I'm trying to be creative. On the transportation side, nuclear power is a big deal for me. It's clean, it's clean in its emission, but we have a storage problem of spent fuel, and I think there's ways we can deal with that. On the transportation side, probably the most exciting of all, Mr. Chairman, is that all the major car manufacturers have said that they're going to go to an electric vehicle fleet by 2035, 2040. So I would like to sit down with the chairman and other Democrats to see if we could redesign the Highway Trust Fund. Electric vehicles are not paying into the trust fund. I was told yesterday that the Biden administration opposes an increase in the gas tax. Well, I'm a Republican, but we've increased gas taxes at home in South Carolina because the Highway Trust Fund has a huge deficit. And I know it's a regressive tax, but there's ways maybe we can do rebates. So count me in for accelerating the electrification of the transportation system. You may have hydrogen-fueled vehicles that do not emit CO2. So there's a lot of things going on. And one of the roles that we can play at the federal level is to encourage these developments through research and development. Bill Gates, I've talked to extensively. He thinks that the major thing that the government can do is create some robust funding for R&D and let the private sector sort of flourish. Now, when you say we, I hope you mean India and China, because we, the family of nations here, doesn't do much good for us to do all this if other people don't follow. But to my Republican colleagues, it's just a matter of time until most cars, I don't know how long I'm going to live, but this century for sure, that most vehicles will be running on something other than gasoline. I've talked to the fossil fuel industry. I find them very open to change. They just want to be able to manage that change. It'll be a while before we get away from gas-driven cars, and we're going to need gas as a transportation fuel as possible. Natural gas as a heating source is very, very much with us. So count me in for exploring clean energy, but thinking outside the box what that would include, algae and nuclear power. So just end with this. I've tried to learn about the problem and realize that what we do here has to be done in a fashion to not destroy our economy in the name of a great cause. Other people have to come on board too. I've tried to be rational about threats. I think climate change is a real threat to our way of life. I think over time, the way we've lived has caused this problem, and we can find a way to live a different way that's good for the environment and would be good for job creation. From a foreign policy point of view, imagine the world where fossil fuels were not so readily available to rogue regimes. Imagine a world where the Iranian Ayatollah couldn't rely on oil production as almost 90% of his income. The Russians. I find it kind of interesting that the foreign policy consequences of moving to a clean energy business footprint would change the geopolitics of the world dramatically. Most of the bad actors out there depend on fossil fuels for their revenue. So that's the side of it that I think we need to talk more about. And finally, threats. My Democratic colleagues are telling me that the planet will cease to exist as we know it in a decade. Maybe so. I'm not so sure I'm sold on that, but I'm definitely sold on the problem of climate change being real, and the sooner we address it, the better. And I just wish you had the same attitude about Afghanistan. We're down to 2,500 troops, and we're going to withdraw them all, and radical Islam is going to come roaring back unattended. And we know what they can do if nobody's watching them. So I find it disappointing that we can't look at threats rationally across the board, Mr. Chairman. For a relatively small investment compared to the past, we can make sure that Al-Qaeda and ISIS never comes back to receive sanctuary in Afghanistan. And here's what I want to remind you of. Climate change is real. The devastation of the planet is definitely happening. At what rate, we can debate, but it's real. If they could get a nuclear weapon, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, would they use it? Yes. If they could find a way to do something other than fly planes into buildings to kill more of us, would they? Yeah. That threat is really real, and we're basically leaving it unattended. So count me in for dealing with threats across the board, rationally, the lowest cost possible, the least disruption possible, the least wear and tear on our military. But ignoring a threat, Mr. Chairman, doesn't make it go away. Count me in working with you to deal with the threat the planet faces from climate change. I hope you and your colleagues on the other side will look at threats that radical Islam present to the nation and the world writ large and see if our policies make sense.
Senator Graham, thank you very much. We have an excellent group of panelists, and let me begin with David Wallace-Wells. Mr. Wallace-Wells is editor-at-large at New York Magazine and author of The Uninhabitable Earth, an international bestseller describing the risks we face from inaction on climate change. David, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders. Thank you, Ranking Member Graham and other members of the committee. It's a privilege to be here today. In 2020, what was once called the novel coronavirus killed, according to the CDC, 350,000 Americans. According to new research, that same number, 350,000, die even in an unexceptional year from the air pollution produced from the burning of fossil fuels. Decarbonize, and we could save those lives. The figures are so large they can seem almost hard to credit, but this is a familiar paradox from climate science, which offers harrowing assessments we know, must know, also offer the clearest picture we have of the uncertain future that awaits us should we fail to act. Globally, 8.7 million annual deaths have been attributed to fossil fuel pollution. That is death at the scale of the Holocaust every single year. The average resident of Delhi has had his or her life expectancy cut short by 9 years. Globally, the figure is 2 years. Now, here in the US, we have what qualifies as enviable air quality. According to the NRDC, the Clean Air Act is still saving 370,000 American lives every year, delivering economic benefits of $3 trillion annually, 32 times the cost of enacting that bill. But unfortunately, many of these gains could be undone by pollution produced by wildfire. In 2020, American fires accounted for more than half of all air pollution in the western US, meaning that more particulate matter from the burning of forest infiltrated the lungs of Americans living in those states than from all other industrial and human activity combined. Now, California is still standing, mostly, after its horrific fires, as is Australia, after 46 million acres burned there last year, and Houston, after 5 of what were once called 500-year storms hit in a period of just 5 years. And we are still here today, after a record $22 billion weather disasters last year, debating what measures to take to stall the growth and blunt the force of warming. All a sign that climate impacts aren't the whole of our destiny, but instead form the natural landscape on which our future will be built and contested. Now, you may think of climate change as a slow process, but half of all of the emissions ever produced in the entire history of humanity have come in just the last 25 years. That's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the premiere of Friends. That means climate responsibility for the present crisis and preventing its worsening is alive on the planet today. In fact, it's in this room. Now, I'm not an old man, I'm 38 years old. Almost 2/3 of all carbon emissions ever produced have been produced in my lifetime. 1/4 have been produced since Joe Biden was elected vice president in 2008. 1/3 have been produced since Senator Graham first joined the Senate. To pull up short of what was once called a catastrophic level of warming, 2 degrees, requires us to decarbonize at least as fast as that, and possibly faster. And if we don't, the future projected by science is shrouded by uncertainty about how the climate system will react and how humans will too, both through mitigation and adaptation, which will be necessary. But at just 2 degrees of warming, flooding events that would have happened once a century would come every year. The land burned by fires in the American West could grow 2-fold, perhaps 6-fold, excuse me. And because there's a natural limit on the amount of heat and humidity the human body can endure, a measure called wet bulb temperature, cities across the Middle East and South Asia that are today home to millions would routinely be so hot during summer that you couldn't go safely outside and certainly couldn't work outside for long periods without risking heat stroke or death. Past 2 degrees, and the number of deaths from air pollution could grow by 150 million. At 3 degrees, war could double. And estimates of the aggregate economic impact of unmitigated climate change are crude and vary widely, with some older models suggesting an impact of just a few percentage points and others offering much higher estimates. Compared with a world without warming, between 2.5 and 3 degrees, the world would lose between 15 and 25% of per capita global output, according to one much-cited paper, which means, of course, that much could be saved by avoiding it. Now, just a few years ago, it seemed prudent to plan for scenarios north of 3 degrees. Thanks to a global political awakening, growing cultural pressure, and rapid improvements in the cost of renewables, those scenarios now appear considerably less likely. But even that new measured optimism is shrouded in uncertainty too. And as any investor or economist would tell you, uncertainty itself is a cost. Not an excuse for inaction, but the opposite. As they would also tell you, foregone benefits are a cost too. And this, I think, is the biggest news on climate, that the benefits of decarbonization, once considered trivial, are in fact enormous. That is why last year, Duke's Drew Shindell testified before the House that a total decarbonization of the American electricity sector would entirely pay for itself through the public health benefits of cleaner air. Why estimates of the jobs created by that work grow into the millions, and why during the pandemic, and independent of any international pressure, ambitious net zero commitments were made by South Korea, Japan, the EU, and most significantly, China, each stitching climate considerations and the benefits of action into every aspect of their planning and policy. They all see the gains to be seized. Do we? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our second witness is Dr. Robert Litterman. He's chair of the Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Dr. Litterman is a leading advocate for addressing climate risks in the financial markets, and he was named 2013 Risk Manager of the Year by the Global Association of Risk Professions. Dr. Litterman, thanks so much for being with us.
Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Graham, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to address the risks that climate change poses and my suggestions for how to deal with them. The best science shows that damage from climate change is already serious and could range in the future from severe to catastrophic. Risks of this magnitude demand immediate, ambitious response, including a price on carbon. Today, the world is hopeful for U.S. leadership on climate action, but appropriate management of climate risk requires action by this Congress. My name is Bob Litterman. I'm an economist by training and have spent my career managing financial risk. I chair the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, which published its report on managing climate risk in the U.S. financial system last fall. I worked at Goldman Sachs for 23 years, where I finished as a partner in 2009. I led the firm-wide risk management department and later managed the quantitative strategies group in the asset management division. I'm currently a partner at an investment firm, Kepos Capital. Financial risk management has several simple principles that apply to managing climate risk. Most important, risk managers must look at the full distribution of potential future outcomes. Risk management requires imagining and designing policies to prevent extremely bad, but very plausible scenarios. Identifying these scenarios is especially hard for climate risk because we're performing this experiment for the first time on a very complex system. David Wallace Wells has done a commendable job illustrating the scientific research on such worst-case scenarios. Another principle of financial risk management, which is perhaps not as obvious, is that our objective is not to minimize risk, but rather to price risk appropriately. For example, at Goldman Sachs, we would charge traders for the risks that they took, forcing them to take risks only where the firm would be more than compensated by the expected returns on their trades. A third principle of risk management is that time is a scarce resource. If we have enough time, we can solve almost any problem. It is when time runs out that risk breeds catastrophe. The risk from climate change is increasing as we fill the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. We do not know how much time we have before we cross a tipping point, after which the threat of numerous environmental disasters becomes irreversible. This is an extremely urgent matter. More colloquially, we are barreling toward a hazard of our own making. Now we need to brake fast and hard. We must reduce emissions and move rapidly to a net zero emissions economy. The scale and urgency of that transformation require that financial markets immediately and dramatically increase the flow of capital towards investments that will reduce emissions. Then, we will almost certainly need to follow that by removing significant quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Making those investments profitable and fostering the innovation necessary requires putting a price on carbon. Whether it is the National Academies of Sciences, the Business Roundtable, or the American Petroleum Institute, to cite some recent examples, or Nobel-winning economists like Professor Stiglitz, experts and interested parties largely agree. The most straightforward manner to price carbon is placing a tax on fossil fuel production. The risk management component of the carbon tax is the incentive it creates to reduce emissions. The proceeds can be used however Congress determines. The Climate Leadership Council, which I co-chair with Catherine Murdoch, has developed the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividend Plan. There, the revenues of a tax on fossil fuel producers would be returned directly to households, a just approach with progressive outcomes. Other options include funding clean energy R&D or infrastructure investments, given the significant budgetary effects of a carbon price. I recognize that there are a variety of opinions about how to design a carbon price, but leadership and compromise can help build strong coalitions of support. To manage climate risks, the key would be to create a price immediately, set it high enough to reflect the risks imposed by greenhouse gas emissions, and apply it to emissions across the entire economy. I and my colleagues stand ready to help you deliberate on these policies and do what is best for Americans and the future. Thank you.
Dr. Litterman, thanks very much. Our next witness is Dr. Joseph Stiglitz, economist and professor at Columbia University. Dr. Stiglitz received the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics and served as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Clinton administration. He was also lead author of the United Nations 1995 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Dr. Stiglitz, thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of my concerns about the large economic cost and huge risks of not taking strong actions now to deal with climate change, and the large benefits of doing so. Senator Sanders has already described a variety of numbers characterizing the adverse effects of climate change, and there are multiple studies providing similar numbers. Some of these downside risks are already apparent. In one recent year, for instance, the magnitude of the destruction associated with extreme weather events in the United States alone was more than 1.5% of GDP, effectively wiping out more than 60% of the growth of that year. Rising sea levels will put much coastal property underwater, destroying homes and property values. Recent studies have documented the adverse effects of climate change on health. During the past year, we have seen the inequities associated with COVID-19. Those associated with climate change are equally severe. But there's an additional dimension of inequity that speaks to our future. While COVID-19 disproportionately affected older Americans, climate change is a risk that we impose on our children and our grandchildren. If we leave them a world in which they will have to confront climate change and its consequences, we are truly bequeathing them a real debt, substantially lowering their standards of living. We have been treating scarce resources, our environment, our water, our air, as if they were free. But there's no such thing as a free lunch. We will have to pay the check someday. Delay is costly. Taking carbon out of the atmosphere is far more expensive than not putting it into the atmosphere in the first place. A smooth transition is far less costly than the one we will surely face if we do not take action urgently. There will be, for instance, a repricing of carbon assets. The price of carbon assets, such as those associated with coal, do not today adequately reflect the realities of climate change. The longer we delay dealing with climate change, the larger the necessary adjustments will be, and the greater the potential for huge economic disruption of the kind that we've just heard about. An economic disruption that could make the 2008 recession look like child's play by comparison. Among the consequences would be devastation to our banks and our insurance companies. When large calamities occur, the government will pick up the bill. This is a huge hidden liability on the government's balance sheet. That's why it's imperative that we start assessing, regulating systemic climate risk. I want to end on a sunnier note. Doing something about climate change could be a real boon for the economy. The number of jobs that will be lost in the old fossil fuel industries are dwarfed by those that will be created in the new industries. The value created in the new industries will also dwarf the value of the stranded assets in the fossil fuel and related sectors. The current focus on changing to a green economy is already stimulating enormous innovation. The price of renewable energy has been plummeting. Our country especially has much to gain because innovation is a key comparative advantage. If we are ahead of the game, we will develop technology that will be in demand around the world. Government has an important role in enabling, facilitating, and encouraging the transition to a green economy. This is most obvious in public investments in infrastructure and R&D. But there is much more to be done. Ending fossil fuel subsidies is one example, and I commend the introduction of the bill to do that. Requiring full disclosure of climate risk, changing statutes governing fiduciary responsibility to mandate looking at these long-term risks. We shouldn't be insuring banks that make loans that put our planet at risk. There is, I believe, the need for the founding of a national infrastructure bank and preceding the creation of community, state, and regional banks to facilitate green investments. As we've already heard, prices help guide decisions. That's why assigning a near zero price to resources that are scarce is such a bad mistake. We need to employ a significantly high social cost of carbon, accompanied by regulations and public investments that will enable us to deal with the risks that have rightly been called existential. This is a defining moment in history. On the one hand, we can ignore these risks, at great peril to our future. The costs of not taking action are huge. On the other hand, we can seize this opportunity. What we have accomplished in the last 20 years should provide us with confidence that this new economy can provide a new era of innovation, creating more and better jobs and a higher standard of living. This new era will play to American strength, to the determination and ingenuity of people, and the vitality of its institutions, including those that have long fostered innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stiglitz. Our next witness is George Oliver, Chairman and CEO of Johnson Controls and Chair of the Business Roundtable Energy and Environment Committee. Mr. Oliver previously served as CEO of Tyco Safety Products and held several leadership positions during his 20-year career with General Electric. He also sits on the board of directors at Raytheon Company. Mr. Oliver, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. I'm George Oliver, Chairman and CEO of Johnson Controls. I also serve as Chair of the Energy and Environment Committee at Business Roundtable, and am appearing today on behalf of both. I want to thank you for holding this important meeting and for the invitation to appear. Founded in 1885, Johnson Controls is a global leader in smart, healthy, and sustainable building technology solutions. Business Roundtable represents over 200 CEOs of America's largest employers from across all sectors of the U.S. economy. Climate change is real and must be addressed. In 2007, Business Roundtable became the first broad-based business organization to recognize the threats of climate change and the need to address the risks. In September, Business Roundtable released new policies and principles for addressing climate change. CEOs know that climate change poses significant environmental, economic, public health, and security threats. At Johnson Controls, sustainability is our business. We committed to achieving net zero carbon emissions before 2040 and announced science-based targets for 2030. We are AAA MSCI rated and proud to be ranked among the 100 most sustainable companies globally. And that leadership is critical for our customers. About 40% of global emissions are related to buildings. We tackle that with building products and digital capabilities like our OpenBlue platform that cut energy in buildings 50% or more. One of the reasons companies have taken climate so seriously is because failure to address global climate change could mean trillions of dollars in lost US GDP over the coming decades. It is clear the risks associated with unchecked climate change are real, they're increasing, they are costly, and they may be irreversible. The US must lead by example. Johnson Controls and Business Roundtable support a comprehensive policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and incentivize new technologies. Business Roundtable's September climate position outlines 11 principles to guide policy design. These include leveraging market-based solutions, preserving the competitiveness of businesses, and minimizing potential negative impacts while maximizing benefits. I'd like to discuss with you 3 key areas that will help us meet the scope of the climate challenge. The first is energy efficiency. Johnson Controls partners with government to deliver emissions reductions while decreasing the burden on the taxpayer. We are embarking on a partnership with GSA that will result in guaranteed savings of about $6.2 million per year in energy and water across several historic buildings, including the White House complex. It will also reduce greenhouse gases by 20,000 tons per year, the equivalent of removing 4,500 cars from the road. And Johnson Controls is leading similar efforts for our customers across all sectors. For example, Mr. Chairman, in your home state of Vermont, we partnered with Rutland to modernize schools and reduce emissions. The project cut the need for capital by funding the upgrades through energy savings. Senator Graham, in South Carolina, we did a similar project for Charleston, where we saved them over $15 million and reduced carbon emissions by over 45,000 tons. We encourage Congress to support performance contracting and public-private partnerships to save money and slash emissions. The second is invest in technology. In cases like the building sector in which Johnson Controls operates, there is a clear pathway to significant cost-effective emissions reductions. In other sectors like steel, chemicals, and cement, we will require new technologies, breakthrough technologies. That's why Business Roundtable supports at least doubling federal funding for advanced energy innovation and deployment of low emissions and carbon removal technologies. Third is placing a price on carbon. Business Roundtable CEOs believe climate policy should begin with a market-based strategy and a price on carbon. Paired with public support for R&D and smart regulations, a clear price signal can encourage innovation, preserve competitiveness, spur growth, and provide assistance for impacted communities. So in conclusion, it is clear the risks and potential costs associated with unchecked climate change are real. The United States and the international community must aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions and incentivize new technologies. At Johnson Controls, we are taking on this challenge for ourselves and for our customers. We will cut emissions, cut costs, create good jobs, and more resilient, healthy infrastructure. I know many other Business Roundtable members are doing the same. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to appear today. Together, I am confident we can tackle this problem. I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Mr. Oliver, thank you very much for your presentation. Our final witness is Richard Powell, Executive Director of ClearPath Incorporated. Richard has served on the advisory committee to the Export-Import Bank of the U.S. since 2019, and he is also on the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Centers Advisory Group. Previously, he worked for McKinsey & Company in their energy and sustainability practices. Mr. Powell, thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Graham, and members of the committee. I'm Rich Powell. I lead ClearPath. We advance policies that accelerate clean energy and industrial innovation. An important note, we receive no industry funding. Given your role in America's fiscally responsible approach to climate change and the economic recovery challenges ahead, I will discuss 5 topics today. First, the threat climate change poses to our economy and federal budget. Second, the need to invest in targeted solutions versus endlessly spending. Third, the opportunity for investments in clean energy, like implementing the Energy Act of 2020. Fourth, the reality that we can only build new clean energy projects as fast as we can permit them. And fifth, the priority to build on the historic, strong, bipartisan support for clean energy innovation. Climate change is real, and global industrial activity is the dominant contributor. And the challenge it poses to society merits significant action at every level of government and the private sector. Lawmakers and businesses across the country are prioritizing investments in climate change adaptation efforts. For example, the Republican Florida State Legislature just last week advanced a bill to Governor DeSantis' desk which would require a master plan to address sea level rise and flooding and establish a fund to provide up to $100 million annually for climate resiliency projects. Managing our country's debt will be another defining challenge of this century. As millions of Americans hand over their hard-earned income on tax day, they are also wondering how our national debt recently surpassed $28 trillion. Since 1980, the United States has spent $1.9 trillion in disaster recovery from $290 billion events, all deficit spending. If we don't invest in adaptation and mitigation now, climate change will require massively deepening our deficit spending in the future. As you consider the budgetary demands of these challenges and the President's skinny budget proposal, it is important U.S. policy synchronizes with the global nature of the climate challenge. Existing clean technology is simply not up to the task of global decarbonization. The global supply of clean energy has remained stagnant since 2005. To make a dent in the global problem, we need to focus on breakthrough technologies. Developing countries choosing to buy and build clean energy technologies over carbon-intensive ones should be our goal. Today, many developing countries are choosing Chinese coal plants because they're cheaper to buy, easier to build, and better performing as an energy system than the clean technologies available to them. The U.S. cannot regulate or tax our way to a global solution. We don't have a magical mechanism to simultaneously regulate other countries' emissions. So what to do? We need to innovate and demonstrate here and deploy abroad. To do so, we must realize new energy technologies in the U.S. have not happened without investments from the Department of Energy. Two of the breakthrough clean energy technologies responsible for the more than 30% carbon emissions reduction in the U.S. power system since 2005 are hydraulic fracturing and solar energy. Both follow the same pathway to success: earlier government R&D targeting outcomes, partnerships with private industry, and tax incentives to facilitate commercialization. This government support, while useful, should expire as technologies become commercially viable. Without this federal support, even a superior energy technology won't be able to break into the market because of the incumbent technologies have the scale and supporting infrastructure of a 50-year head start. The exciting news? At the end of 2020, Congress passed one of the biggest advancements in clean energy and climate policy we've seen in over a decade, with the monumental Energy Act of 2020. Specifically, the Energy Act supports key research, development, and demonstration programs for more than 20 commercial-scale projects across 5 major technology areas, like advanced nuclear reactors, carbon capture, or long-duration energy storage by the middle of this decade. DOE is most successful when it sets long-term, aggressive milestones to develop technologies at price points and performance levels that are meaningful for private markets. The priority now must be on implementing the Energy Act, fully funding these demonstration programs and overseeing rapid action at the Department of Energy. As we reimagine our energy grid using exciting new technologies, permitting modernizations must keep pace. This transition will require tens of thousands of miles of new pipelines carrying hydrogen and captured carbon dioxide from power plants and industrial facilities, new transmission infrastructure to carry electricity around an increasingly electrified country, and new nuclear reactors and power plants sited everywhere. This will be the largest continental construction project in history, and every single project will begin with a permit. Making the permitting process more efficient is essential for 2 reasons: stewardship of taxpayer resources and scaling clean energy rapidly. The bipartisan authorizations in the Energy Act and the most recent fiscal year 2020 and 2021 appropriations bills are great successes. I applaud the critical programmatic direction on clean energy innovation and look forward to seeing more bipartisan success this Congress. Thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Oliver, thank you very much. Our final witness is Richard Powell, Executive Director of. We've already had him. Oh, Jesus, I am sorry. All right, that's it.
I wanted to hear it again.
All right.
I'm happy to take another turn. If you'd like to.
All right, I think we're ready for questions. Let me begin by asking Mr. Wallace Wells a question. If we do not act and act extremely aggressively, tell us what the future of our country and planet will look like.
Well, the answer to that question is covered with several layers of uncertainty. So if we decarbonize rapidly, the climate system may still prove more sensitive than we expect, which could bring more warming than we would like. But taking as a sort of a baseline that our best models are good indications of where the climate is heading, we are globally, it's been estimated by some of the best people studying this, on track for about 3 degrees of warming. That means that we have a long way to go to get to 2 degrees and below 2 degrees, which is what the scientific community. And
David, to the average person, 3 degrees, so what? What's the problem? It's a little bit warmer. What's the impact in our country and around the world? What does 3 degrees mean?
well, we could see war doubling. We could see crop yields falling by at least 20%, maybe 50%. We could see migration in the tens of millions. We could see cities all across South Asia become so hot that you couldn't walk around outside without risking death. As a result, you'd see huge, again, huge mass migrations. The effect on economic productivity, even in the northern latitudes, places like the U.S., would be quite dramatic. There'd be extreme weather hitting, events that used to hit every 50 years, every 100 years, hitting every single year, and the number of billion-dollar disasters that would be accumulating, even in places like the United States, would be quite intense. Those impacts are all going to hit parts of the world, and then within individual countries, hitting parts of those countries, hitting those people hardest who are least able to respond, hitting the poorest, the marginalized, and really straining our ability to promise a future of prosperity and justice and equity to future generations,
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Litterman, as you know, Wall Street is continuing to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the fossil fuel industry. Why are they continuing these investments despite the costs laid out by Mr. Wallace Wells and Professor Stiglitz?
Yeah, the problem is that those costs are not internalized. These are external costs. And so what businesses do, what investors do, is they look for opportunities to make profits given the incentives that they have. The problem is we have a bug in the tax code. We're not creating the appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. And this problem is a problem that needs to be identified. It needs to be addressed by Congress. When I chaired the CFTC Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, we had unanimous agreement that the most important and most urgent recommendation 1 out of 53 that we made, is that we put a price on carbon. And that's because all the participants in the financial markets understand how efficient they are at moving capital to where there's opportunities to make money. That's what we do. And it's given the incentives that we have. We have the wrong incentives. This is actually very simple to fix. You have to give the private sector the appropriate incentives to reduce emissions, and then they'll all be moving in the right direction. Right now, we're all moving in the wrong direction because we have the wrong incentives.
Okay, thanks very much. Dr. Stiglitz, economics has been thought of as the dismal science, and we're doing a lot of dismal discussion today. But there is, I think, some positive aspects about transforming our energy system. Can you talk about what moving aggressively in moving away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy would mean in terms of our economy and the creation of good jobs?
Very much. I wanted to emphasize that it actually is a real opportunity to transform our economy, create enormous value. One of the issues is that, and it was emphasized by other people in this hearing, that if you have more efficient buildings, you save over the long term enormous amount of money. And that's resources that can go to other uses. That the cars that are electric last a long time. And at the same time, for the next 10, 15 years, we're going to be creating an enormous number of jobs as we create the green infrastructure that we need. And we're also going to have jobs at a higher level where we're creating the R&D. And as we create that R&D, it also emphasized that our ability to export the new technologies to make this a global effort to reduce carbon emissions will earn us a lot of money. So not only this is one of those areas where we're going to be doing well by doing good. If we can create these new technologies, there's going to be a strong global demand for these technologies, and next plays to our long-term strength.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stiglitz. Senator Graham?
Thank you very much. Mr. Oliver from Johnson Controls, the Business Roundtable supports the price on carbon, is that correct?
A price on carbon, that's correct, Senator.
Does the U.S. Chamber support that?
The when the Business Roundtable put a price, we think that a market-based.
Do you know if the Chamber supports it or not?
I'm not sure, Senator.
So, Mr. Powell, what percentage of emissions, carbon emissions, come from the United States in terms of the world writ large?
We're now down to about 15% of global emissions.
Okay. If we put a price on carbon, what happens if China and India, they do not?
It will not have an effect on decreasing Indian and Chinese emissions, and Chinese emissions are now about double our emissions.
Do you agree with that with Mr. Wallace-Wills?
Well, a tax here won't have an effect abroad, but many of those countries are already signaling an interest in investing in clean energy that goes beyond ours. So they may yet move faster than we expect.
I guess what I would say is that we need to probably move together, because one of the concerns that people have is if we put a price on carbon here, it could create a competitive disadvantage, at least in the short term. What would you say to that, Mr. Wells?
I think the world is shifting on some of these questions such that we don't think about decarbonization as a cost, but an opportunity. And I think that's especially clear with the air pollution data that I cited. Because that is local, the costs are concentrated within national borders, and it means that the incentives to decarbonize are true for every country everywhere in the world.
Agreed. Do you support an increase in the gas tax to fund the Highway Trust Fund?
I don't have a particular opinion on that policy question. But
What
it
about
seems-
Mr. Powell?
I think we're going to need multiple sources of revenue to increase the Highway Trust Fund, especially as we move more to electric vehicles. The gas tax won't be able to do it alone.
Do you also support the idea that an electric vehicle pay into the Highway Trust Fund somehow?
I think we'll need to do that if we want to maintain our infrastructure.
Okay. So now that's different than an economy-wide price on carbon. I've talked to the Climate Leadership Council yesterday, and I've talked to Senator Whitehouse a lot about this. What you do with the money is really important. If you rebate it to the consumer, it lessens some of the fears that people have about increased cost at the gas tank, increased heating cost, running your business. So the bottom line for me is I know it's a problem, and everybody's sort of looking at each other on my side. Y'all have gotten solutions that I don't think I can get there. It's a 50-50 Senate. But if the chamber, you got the Business Roundtable, I'm just talking from a Republican point of view. We're going to do a hearing, Mr. Chairman, on electric vehicles, right? As part of we hope so.
Yeah.
See, I've got BMW and Volvo in South Carolina. Senator Stabenow is sort of the heart and soul of the car business. And it seems to me that all the people making cars are indicating that they're going to go to a non-internal combustion car. And I think they're doing that for multiple reasons. When the biggest car companies in America are beginning to change their fleet, I would like to find out why they're doing that and what can we do on the production side, energy efficiency side, sort of to lead the world, not just shame them, but actually make money in a lower carbon economy. So to Senator Whitehouse, who has been a true leader in all this, we'll sit down and talk about a 50-50 Senate, what's possible. But I'd like to start a discussion that maybe can bear fruit over time here and get the Business Roundtable and other groups on the business side that support a price on carbon, find out what kind of rebate is fair that will get you the most political support. So from my point of view, it's inevitable that we're going to a lower carbon economy. That's a good thing. And I'd end with this one thought. Do you all agree? It would be a nightmare for the Ayatollah and Putin if we went to a lower carbon economy anytime soon. I assume silence means yes. Okay, thank you.
I'll stipulate to that from my position.
Okay, thank you, Senator Graham. Senator Stabenow.
Yes, and I would stipulate to that as well. So I want to thank, Mr. Chairman, you and our ranking member, and want to thank Senator Graham. I want to say ditto in terms of the discussion we need to have around electric vehicles and manufacturing and where we go. It's all about jobs, good-paying jobs, as well as energy independence. It's how we get the energy for the electricity as well becomes very, very important. But it is absolutely true that our American automakers are moving toward an all-electric fleet. In fact, GM has said that by 2035, Ford is doing the same thing. What I find exciting is that they are now looking at, they are going to be rolling out their large profit center vehicles like the F-150 truck or the Chevy Silverado as electric. And so that we're seeing the large, what would be carbon emitters now becoming electric, as well as, interestingly, I was at the unveiling of an all-electric Hummer last week, which was also very exciting to see where they're going. So count me in on all of that, as well as supply chain and manufacturing and all the things that we can do to help the economy. I want to talk, though, with my agriculture hat on. I am chairwoman of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, and I'm hearing all the time from farmers and ranchers and foresters, of course, natural disasters getting worse and worse and worse. They are right at the front of all of this. We see crops being destroyed. We see all kinds of challenges because of the climate crisis, as well as water issues and a whole range of things in the Great Lakes. But the producers on the front lines also know that they can be a part of the solution. And in fact, they're already sequestering carbon, but we can develop policies to support them, to help them do it even more, to create a way for them to be able to have a revenue source from selling carbon credits. I believe that they are ready to do that, very anxious to ramp up their conservation efforts. I have several bipartisan bills that really drive this transition, two with Senator Braun on the committee. One of those, the key bill, Growing Climate Solutions. I want to thank Senator Whitehouse and Senator Graham for also being our bipartisan co-sponsors on an approach through the USDA to really activate what we can do with agriculture and forestry. And so I would very much like to hear from all the panelists or any that wish to respond, that speak to the need not only to reduce emissions from electricity and transportation, but also to find new ways to cheaply pull carbon pollution out of the air through things like agriculture and forestry. Would welcome your comments. Mr. Wells, would you like to go first?
Well, yeah, no, it's a crucial part of the equation. Agricultural emissions are a significant contributor to the warming that we see, even though most Americans probably don't appreciate that. And as you say, American farmers and farmers all around the world have been very much, hit in the face with extreme weather. I believe several of the last few years, American farmers have actually made more money on insurance payments than they've made on their crops, and that is a devastating, harbinger of the future. In terms of the solution side, soil can be used and plants can very, very truly be used to have an effect on our overall emissions. I think that there is an opportunity there that we haven't yet seized, although, as you say, some farmers are moving in that direction. I think that we need to do more than just price carbon to push that along, because, I'm glad to know that fellow witnesses and other senators here agree that pricing carbon higher is effective, but I would emphasize that those impacts are different from sector to sector, and while they are very helpful, especially in power and electricity, they make less of a difference to the bottom line of farmers, and I would like to see more emphasis on agricultural policy, regulation, and investment in R&D to help those farmers do better and farm more responsibly, rather than relying simply on the crude impact of a carbon tax.
Yes, sir.
I think this broader topic of carbon dioxide removal is extremely important, and I thank you for your leadership on these strategies. I think we should remember that many of the goals that large companies have made have been net zero emission goals, so that means they'll bring their emissions down as far as possible and then rely on other offsets or removal technologies. Obviously, farms and forests can play a huge part of that solution. We'll probably need technological solutions as well, or even hybrid models which contain the carbon dioxide removal characteristics of biological systems with technical systems to permanently sequester that CO2 underground. I think one of the things that you could do immediately on this, in addition to things like the Growing Climate Solutions Act, is also make sure that the demonstration programs for carbon dioxide removal that were included in the Energy Act of 2020 are fully funded through the appropriations process.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. Thank you. I know I'm out
Let me
of
just,
time.
oh,
I would love to hear from others, I guess, if we
yeah,
can think about. Yes,
let me just emphasize the complementarity between the incentive systems that are provided by credits, which I think are very important, with the investments in R&D and regulations that help direct attention towards better farming practices, and that terrestrial carbon, the carbon that's sequestered in the soil and in plants, are a very important part of our systematic approach to addressing climate change. A very large, about 20% of all carbon emissions are related to deforestation and other agricultural practices. So your emphasis on agriculture is really very important.
thank you. And if any,
Yeah, and I would agree. Excuse me. Senator, I would agree with that. We had a healthy discussion on this recently.
yes,
And as I've learned more, I think as we think about from a business roundtable standpoint, carbon dioxide removal technologies are going to be critical in the overall goal to get to net zero carbon emissions. And I think this is, when we think about a price on carbon, this is going to be one of those critical elements that we got to take a look at and make sure it's incorporated into the overall structure.
thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator.
And Senator, if I could just add, first of all, I agree with all the other witnesses, and I would just make one other observation, which is that what we need is innovation. And when governments pick, strategies or technologies to support, they're making the choices. When we set up the incentives through a pricing system, every entrepreneur, every business, every investor has an opportunity to try and figure out which is going to be the best solution.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Whitehouse has been a leader on this whole discussion. And Sheldon, if you need a couple of minutes more, please take it.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it very much. And I want to thank you for holding this hearing. And I particularly want to thank the witnesses that we have. We have one of the, I think, most impressive panels of witnesses that have ever gathered on climate change in this United States Congress. So I'm really grateful to you all for being here. I did want to make one point before I got to my questioning, and that is where I think we are in terms of getting to a solution. And it relates back to some of what Mr. Oliver has said. The economic risks that we're talking about are many, they are profound, they are deeply dangerous. And I have sent to every single colleague in the Senate quite some time ago this volume, which contains 17 of the most serious warnings of economic crash that are out there. Economic crash can be viewed as the carbon bubble bursting. It can be viewed as coastal property values collapse. It can be viewed as uninsurability, knocking the bottom out of the insurance industry. And there's no reason that those three can't all happen in a cascade of economic collapse. So these are really dire warnings. And nobody except Democrats got back to me. I sent these with a personal note. No one. And I remember when I first got here, Senator Sanders and I were in the same class. We came at the same time. Senator Graham was here then. For our first 3 years here, there was a lot of bipartisanship on climate change. By my count, there were 4 efforts in the Senate, all bipartisan, all serious. And our friend Senator McCain, as the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, campaigned on a strong climate platform. That was where we were. Then in January of 2010, all of that bipartisanship stopped dead as if it had hit a wall. It was like watching an echocardiogram go dead when the patient went dead. What happened? What happened was Citizens United in January of 2010. When Citizens United, when the 5 Republican appointees who opened the floodgates to unlimited money in politics made that decision, the fossil fuel industry instantly went to work to take advantage of that new power. And since then, they have run through secret money, behind front groups, across a whole variety of election manipulation strategies, a consistent effort to undermine Congress's ability to address climate change, with the result that since Citizens United, no Republican senator has since gotten onto any serious economy-wide piece of climate legislation. None. Zip. Zero. What the fossil fuel industry has done in our politics makes me think of Winston Churchill's phrase many years ago of committing a crime that has no name. And I think history will look back on the covert operation run by the fossil fuel industry against its own country to debilitate and incapacitate our own government from addressing this problem as one of history's vilest political acts. And that's why we are where we are right now. And the corporate community is starting to stand up now. BRT is starting to stand up. Climate Leadership Council is starting to stand up. But I will tell you, as somebody who sits in Congress, that the corporate presence on this issue is still net negative. Even if you take out the fossil fuel industry's continued efforts from behind front groups and with dark money to stop progress, even if you remove all of them, the remaining sectors of corporate America are still net negative. It is telling that neither Ranking Member Lindsey Graham, nor Mr. Oliver know what the position of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is on a price on carbon. It shows that their statements that they nominally support one are sure nominal. And I can tell anybody who's listening that my colleagues on the Republican side, which is where the pressure has been focused, don't see any countervailing pressure to worry about from anywhere in corporate America. Not from Wall Street. They've got a big lobbying apparatus. It's not deployed on this. Not from Silicon Valley. TechNet's performance on climate politically has been a disgrace. Not from the agricultural sector, not from big ag, not from the consumer products lobbies. Nobody from corporate America who touches Congress directly is expressing any interest in getting anything done on climate. And I will tell you that when the BRT has a meeting or the CLC has a meeting and they make a statement or an announcement or they send a letter to President Biden, all that is good. But if it isn't touching Congress, it doesn't have effect in Congress. And time is running out for corporate America, if it really cares about this issue, to tell its damn lobbyists and trade associations to take it seriously. The discrepancy between what corporate America tells the public about its attitude on climate change and what it tells Congress about its attitude on climate change is a disgraceful discrepancy. Every major American corporation ought to do an independent audit of its own lobbying and electioneering and political influence efforts in the last decade. And I think CEOs would be very surprised to find where their company's footprint is on climate change, because I will suspect that it will very often be exactly adverse to their stated public position. Talk about sustainability, that's not sustainable. So that's the point I wanted to make. If that changes, a lot of gateways open. And the measure of when that has changed is when a Republican senator or member of Congress will stand up and say, I'm behind this bill. Here's something I will stake my flag on. I'm behind this bill that's an economy-wide carbon measure. So that's the statement I wanted to make. I appreciate it. I have 2 questions. The first is for Professor Stiglitz, who I'm really honored is here. I admired so much his testimony in the young person's lawsuit, his affidavit. Professor, the International Monetary Fund has calculated the subsidy in the United States of America for fossil fuel every single year at $600 billion, billion with a B, $600 billion every year supporting the fossil fuel industry just in the United States. And obviously, a number like that is based on negative, what economists call negative externalities, the harm that fossil fuel emissions cause that doesn't get baked back into the price of the product, which Milton Friedman and the most conservative economists would all agree is a fatal economic problem that needs to be addressed. And yet, we don't address it because of the fossil fuel industry's power. And my question for Professor Stiglitz is, when you've got a $600 billion subsidy out there operating in favor of an industry, if you haven't offset that with a price on emissions, what effect does that continuing effective subsidy have on the economy's ability to make the necessary transition to clean energy ahead of climate calamity? Professor. Have we lost Professor Stiglitz?
Absolutely wrong direction. It actually encourages the use of fossil fuels. It makes fossil fuels more competitive than they should. The basic principle that everybody's talked about of a price on carbon, what this is a negative price on carbon. When you're subsidizing carbon, you're encouraging the emissions of greenhouse gases. And so the first order of business should be eliminating the the negative price on carbon that we've been having. That is really the first order of business, and that's why when at the beginning of the hearings it said that you were going to take actions to get rid of these subsidies. It was such an important measure. Let me
Mr. Professor, if I could interject for 1 second, is there any doubt in your mind that negative externalities count as a subsidy and belong in that pricing calculus you just described?
Absolutely no doubt in my mind that what is going on here is that we're subsidizing something that is having a negative effect on our economy. It's going in absolutely the wrong direction.
So let me jump in. Since I'm over my time already, I'm going to jump quickly to my last question, which is to Dr. Litterman, who has made his career assessing risk for Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs, I don't think, tolerates ideology in its risk assessment. It wants to make money, and it only makes money if it gets its risk assessments right. So the premium on accuracy of risk assessment is something that Dr. Litterman has lived with at the highest levels of the American investment community. And from that perspective, I want to ask him, how urgent is it right now that we respond to this climate risk?
Senator, I'm glad you asked that question. The reality is we don't know how much time we have. And with respect to the cost of delay, let me tell you a story from my experience. Years ago, my wife and I were driving on the freeway when she exclaimed, "Oh my God, Bob, watch out." From her tone, the urgency in her voice, I knew instantly I had to pay attention. She had spotted across the divider about a quarter of a mile in front of us an oncoming 18-wheeler bouncing out of control and spewing flames from the passenger side wheel well. I remember immediately slamming on the brakes, even before I had realized, as my wife already had, that the truck was not going straight as I had thought, but was actually careening diagonally right toward us, which is what had terrified her. 5 horrifying seconds later, we managed to avoid, by a fraction of a second, plowing head-on into a gasoline tanker that had exploded right where we would have been. That quick response to my wife's warning saved our lives, because I was able to safely steer our car through the fire and out the other side. We are today, with respect to climate action, in the same position I was when my wife sounded her warning. A growing chorus of scientists, CEOs, national security experts, and financial experts have all seen climate change barreling toward us, and they are shouting, "Watch out."
Senator Brun.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in listening to everything before I got here, I think I can give an update on what the state of the climate is, especially in the U.S. Senate. I got here a little over 2 years ago, and I know that a climate caucus was being attempted to be formed for several years. And when Chris Coons asked me, probably within about 6 months of being here, he told me how hard it was to get that bipartisan discussion going. It was very easy for me. I've been a lifelong conservationist, have been into the idea of how we keep Mother Earth in good shape, have practiced it in my own agricultural involvement, both row crops and as a tree farmer. And there's more buy-in than what you can imagine out there. When you look at this place, which seems to resemble more the Hatfields and McCoys, in the year and a half we've had the Climate Caucus, in the probably 20-plus meetings that we've had, it was the most engaged subject, and I'm even more interested in reforming health care, but there was no discussion on that because the industry, the healthcare industry, is not interested in changing itself. It's the biggest part of our economy that is broken. It is the existential issue of costing, as Warren Buffett describes it, being a tapeworm on the economy. The good news is, in climate, the stakeholders are interested. I was with ConocoPhillips this morning, Cummins Engines right in my own hometown, talking to their CEOs, and you can't believe how interested they are in being part of the solution. And I don't want to overly generalize, but in that year and a half, almost everyone that heads up a major company, and that's not just in the emitters of transportation, electric generation, industrial, about half of which is in two areas, steel and concrete. Farming, we could set the example across the world because we emit as about 10% of our footprint is agriculture. What most folks don't know across the world, that's a much larger contributor, means there's a lot of marginal improvement you can make there. So the state of the discussion is better than what most might imagine. In my own conference, when it took 2 years to get one to step forward, I did it. There are now 6 others, including Ranking Member Lindsey Graham. And we've made a lot of headway. When you look at the other component that's got to fall in place, on my side of the aisle, you got to get grassroots support. And I can tell you there, young conservatives, young Republicans, faith-based, from evangelicals to Catholics, farmers especially, because if there's any business that is high risk, low return, that now not only has the routine weather, but the anomalies that all have measured, they're interested in. And being on a committee that seems to be the least partisan that I'm aware of, and I'm on it, agriculture, Senator Stabenow said that we've got a bill. And I think the way this works is you got to get something across the finish line. The Growing Climate Solutions Act, which we put a lot of effort into, rewards farmers, tree and egg, for good stewardship. And there are voluntary markets out there to reward it. That is just a start, and I think that's got a good chance of making headway this year. So I got a question for each of you, Mr. Wells, Mr. Powell. The biggest question in the room is, how do you pay for it? Chairman and I would have a agreement on things that we need to accomplish here, and we're going to probably be divergent on how you do it, especially in an institution that's got the poorest balance sheet I've observed in the history of the country, actually. That doesn't mean that you can't always borrow more money and do things, but that's not sustainable. Climate and sustainability go hand in hand. I'd love to hear the ideas of how we do this and pay for it, and I'm hoping it's not that the federal government is the only stakeholder in this. I'd like to hear what you think about voluntary markets becoming a bigger deal. And I asked both chairs today, could a pricing market happen within a voluntary, paradigm. So address that and any other ideas on how we pay for it. Mr. Wells, you go first.
Well, what I would say first is that I think, especially when we're talking about decarbonizing the electricity sector, the costs there are genuinely negative, that we will be better off as a country in relatively short order if we move quickly. I mentioned during my prepared remarks that the NRDC calculates that the benefits of the Clean Air Act are $3 trillion annually. That alone would be enough to have paid for the CARES Act of last year, the Biden jobs plan this year, and similarly sized investments every single year going forward. I think when we're talking about that transition, we can do well very quickly by moving fast. Some other sectors of emissions are a little bit more complicated and a little bit hard to pay for. I think there is some room for voluntary payment. If you think about, paying for a carbon offset on to cover an airline ticket, so long as those offsets can be verified, that's useful. But in general, I think we have to stop thinking personally about the cost of action on climate as being enormous and start thinking about the cost of inaction as being considerably higher. And it's, from my perspective, it should be the view of a body like this, and indeed the United States government generally, to be making sure that those investments line up rather than taking a narrow or short-sighted view about upfront costs and not considering the payments that will be coming back to us in relatively short order.
Thank you. Mr. Powell.
Thank you for the question. Senator Braun, thank you for your leadership on the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, on the Nuclear Energy Leadership Act, on the Growing Climate Solutions Act. You've really dug in here, even in your just short time so far in the Senate. As we've discussed, the reason we remain so focused on innovation policy is we really see that as more investing than spending. The benefits we've seen from innovation policy, which is relatively low in cost compared to some other interventions, just have extraordinary returns. If you look at the benefits we've seen in the U.S. economy due to the shale gas revolution, both due to domestic improved air quality, lower carbon emissions, lower energy costs, and now the geopolitical security that our domestic shale gas revolution has provided to us globally, we think that those benefits from that investment in increased tax dollars, in lower geopolitical risk, in improved air quality in the United States, far outweigh the relatively modest costs we made in that innovation investment. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are moving in the right direction, so hope the public understands that. Thank you.
Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Mike.
Thank you for holding this hearing. I think it's good to hear my colleague, Senator Braun, and others acknowledge this enormous challenge.
I'm going to need some, okay.
We've had lots of members talk about the threats that climate change pose. I see it as well from the intel side. I see it from the national security side. We've talked a little bit about, Dr. Stiglitz talked about the jobs opportunity side. One area that I don't think it's gotten enough attention, and I'm going to pose my first question to Dr. Litterman.
Mark, it's a little bit hard to hear you. Can you raise your volume there?
Yeah, my problem. Thanks. I said a bunch of good things about you, Bernie, that I'm, probably.
All right, then repeat them several times. Okay. No, you're better now.
The whole world, I'm fine. All right, I got it. I got it. Let me get straight to the question, which is, I think one other tool that we've not fully utilized is this emerging field around ESG, environmental, societal, and governance standards for public enterprises. I think increasingly we're seeing investors want to see double bottom line investments. I think increasingly we're seeing workforce and customers look to corporations to see how responsible they're going to be on issues like resilience. I think the SEC needs to be involved in this. I was happy to see that Apple recently endorsed mandatory disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions at the SEC. Dr. Litterman and Dr. Stiglitz, can you talk about if we simply made resilience or climate change and effect on climate change a material reportable item, what effect that might have on moving corporations, many of which I think actually want to lean that way, at least their CEOs say they want to lean that way, but we've not given them the regulatory signal that this is appropriate.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I would say, look, the reporting of material risks is already required. That's not the issue. The issue is what climate-related risks are material. And I see that, on the CFTC climate-related market risk report, we had unanimity. We do have to report material risks. The question is, for climate risks, they're very different than traditional financial risks. Traditional financial risks, we have a history, we have a distribution of potential outcomes, and we can ask corporations, what will the impact be on their balance sheet? And then we can decide through a stress test, is this very significant or not? With climate, we're talking about business plans that go decades into the future. Now, you're right that a huge number of corporations have already said, we see the future, it's going toward net zero emissions, and we have a plan to be there. But how do you know as an investor, as an asset owner, is that business plan on target? What are the, goals that are going to be achieved in the next 5 years, for instance? So corporations and the private sector have to work with the financial regulators. And I'm really thrilled to see the response from the regulators. The Fed has joined the NGFS. The SEC has asked for input about disclosure. The CFTC has talked about moving in this direction as well. So I'm not worried about the financial sector and about the regulatory environment. They're all going in the right direction. But the problem is we don't have the right incentives. This regulatory framework will disclose risks, and investors will be able to understand the risks facing corporations. But it's the systemic risk to society that will not be addressed by financial regulation. It has to be addressed by Congress, by setting the right incentives in place to reduce emissions, and by globally harmonizing those incentives so that China and India and Europe all have the same incentives that we have to reduce emissions. And if we do that, I'm very optimistic that we'll get the innovation we need. We will get to that net zero economy, and hopefully soon enough to avoid the worst effects.
Let me put it in a little bit broader economic terms. You can't allocate resources efficiently if you don't have information. And one of the key aspects of information is the risks that a company faces. So it is very important that there be as much full disclosure on a comparable basis of those risks. And we've talked some of those risks today. We talked about the change in the prices of their assets when we reassess the value of a whole variety of assets once we start pricing carbon in. There are risks to property values. Insurance companies face risks of losses. Banks face losses in the non-repayment of certain classes of carbon when they become stranded assets. So one of the things we have to do is work towards broader standards so we can make those disclosures comparable. But a second thing is, from a regulatory point of view, just like we saw in 2008, that there are systemic risks that we didn't fully appreciate when we looked at a bank by bank point of view. And now we are looking at stress tests that look at how the whole financial system operates. The carbon risk is not only in the financial system, it's throughout our economy. And so we have to begin to do systemic risk, not only in our financial system, not only our banks, our insurance companies, but more broadly. And the regulators have to take a lead in making those risk assessments and making those risk assessments available so that investors know exactly how fragile certain parts of the economy are.
And I'd simply say, I know we've gone over my time, and Mr. Chairman, I again appreciate you doing this hearing, but I think this is an area where we could build a broad coalition. This ESG movement is a good movement. It's been too squishy to date. We need to have some set standards that cut across all industries. We've been SASB and other groups have been working on this for years. It really needs some extra effort, and my hope is that the new regulatory regime that's coming in will help make this happen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Warner. Senator Merkley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. As running over to vote, I missed some of what you might have said, so if I ask something repetitive, my apologies. I wanted to start, Mr. Litterman, as you reemphasized the right incentives. And one of the maybe wrong incentives for the tax subsidies that we currently provide for fossil fuels. And today is the day that Chairman Sanders is introducing the End Polluter Welfare Act, and several of us are co-sponsoring it. Have you done any sort of calculation of how essentially reducing all those incentives might compare to price on carbon? Can you translate eliminating those subsidies that exist in the law now, American law, to kind of dollars per gallon or dollars per ton of carbon dioxide?
Well, you start with the fact that, of course, you want to eliminate the subsidies to fossil fuel production and consumption. And you want to take a comprehensive look at all of the incentives that are there, both subsidies and taxes. And when you look at that, I would say the subsidies to the fossil fuels are, they're there, but they're not large relative to the incentives that we need on the other side to reduce emissions. We need strong incentives. As I said, we have to act quickly, and we have to have strong incentives. The way I look at it is, if we put a ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today, we're very likely to have to pull it out at some point in the future. And that's an expensive proposition. So we need strong incentives. It's not just that we need to reduce subsidies. We absolutely do. But we need strong incentives to reduce emissions.
I wondered if you could fill us in on perhaps how much eliminating those current tax incentives might translate to. And Professor Stiglitz, I don't know if you've done that kind of calculation either.
No, I haven't. But let me just emphasize that this is a no-brainer. That is to say, there are some we call low-hanging fruit that you just wonder, why are we pushing the world in the wrong direction? It's hard sometimes to pull it in the right direction, but stopping pushing in the wrong direction seems to me a place where everybody should begin by an agreement.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to another piece of the puzzle, and often we're talking about the demand side in terms of going to more fuel-efficient vehicles, going to electric vehicles, improving our buildings, and so on and so forth. But there are some of us who feel it's important to emphasize the supply side as well. Two examples that are not building new fossil fuel infrastructure, and another is the keep in the ground concept, where the fossil fuels that we own as citizens, we don't pull out of the ground. And there's three kind of basic arguments about this. One is reduce the stranded assets if there's less assets out there, and you've all, several of you have spoken to the stranded assets argument. A second is once you build the infrastructure, and for example, there's the potential LNG facility in Oregon and the pipeline to connect to it to export LNG. Once you build it, there's a huge incentive to keep it operating, and there's huge profits from that go back into the political lobbying and the existing jobs and so forth. So there's a feedback loop that makes it hard and slows the transition to renewables. And the third is that in terms of partnering with the world, and we have a worldwide problem here, if we're not willing to keep our fossil fuels in the ground, if we're not willing to stop building our new fossil fuel infrastructure, then how do we have the moral kind of position to ask other countries to take action when it would affect jobs, and sometimes in far poorer countries, places that need economic development much more than they're more desperate than we are. So there's kind of three arguments there, and I just thought I'd ask about both of you, Mr. Litterman and Professor Stiglitz, if you think there's merit in those arguments.
Oh, very much. And let me emphasize that the decisions that we're making today affect us 20, 30, 40 years from now when we're talking about infrastructure. So that's why those decisions are so important now, that we are locking ourselves in to technologies that will continue, you might say, to plague us for decades to come, and then present an economic problem when they become stranded assets. They're going to wind up on our balance, and the government is going to bail it out, I can assure you. And so those are hidden debts that are going down that we're going to be accruing. Your point about moral leadership around the world, I think, is also very important. There are a lot of concerns, for instance, about the deforestation in Brazil, about Ecuador keeping its oil in the ground. And we ought to be providing incentives for them to do it. There is a rainforest coalition trying to keep the forest in Brazil and Borneo there, which is very important for climate change. But we lose our moral force when we don't take actions. And here, let me say one more thing, which is regulations can be very simple. You know, people often complain regulations are burdensome. You just have a regulation, no coal-fired, fossil fuel-fired electric generating plant will be constructed. Very easy regulation to write and to implement.
Yeah, and the simplicity of keeping the ground is no new leases. You don't sign new leases, which are often exploited for decades, sometimes up to 50 years.
Exactly.
My time is now up, so Mr. Litterman, I apologize. I asked you for your response, so, but I'm going to probably have to take that offline unless the.
No, I think Professor Stiglitz answered well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Senator Merkley, thanks very much. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to all our witnesses here today. Professor Stiglitz, thank you for first talking about the huge costs of doing nothing to address climate change, costs that we're experiencing right now around the country, including in my state of Maryland, where we have rising sea levels. The historic sort of boat show in Annapolis, Maryland, has been threatened by floods, and that's just one example. But also thank you for focusing on the huge economic opportunities and job opportunities of moving immediately and quickly into a clean energy economy. And on that score, I've been working for years to establish what we used to call a green bank. This is a clean energy accelerator, a financing authority. It would be publicly capitalized, but then it would be self-sustaining. And the idea would be to mobilize a lot of private capital and have that multiplier effect. Senator Markey and I have introduced that bill. We call it the National Climate Bank. Also runs as the Clean Energy Accelerator. People prefer to call it that. And I was pleased to see that the President Biden, his American Jobs Act included $27 billion to capitalize that. We proposed $100 billion. We hope to get it there. But I was really glad to see this as part of the President's plan. Can you comment on that initiative as part of an overall effort to move in this direction?
Well, I think it's very important. I've been a strong supporter of green banks, green development banks. And, you know, bipartisan, there's now a broader understanding of the role of industrial policy, that the financial market often doesn't do well in these long-term support that you need, and particularly when there's what we call an externality associated with green. My concern is it's a little too small, or much too small. It needs to be scaled up. I even think that your bill may be too small. When you compare, for instance, what some of other countries have done, the European Investment Bank is an EU investment bank, and one of their main mandates is green investment. And they're bigger than the World Bank. And they're really focusing now on that kind of green transition. And if we want to remain competitive, we have to devise ways of making sure that we have finance for investment. And let me say one of the things I like about your bill, I think it needs to be, this kind of finance has to be done at the national level, at the state level, at the community level. And so thinking of a framework that allows for that kind of creating institutions at these multiple levels. Here in New York State, we have a successful green bank, but of course it needs to be expanded as well. within its confines, it's been doing well, but having this as a national program would be fantastic.
Well, thank you. You know, years ago, we had an initiative like this included in the bill that passed the House back in, goodness, 2009, 10, but that didn't make it through the Senate. So I was glad to see many states move forward, like New York, in establishing their green banks. But the idea here, as you said, is to really do this at the national level. And if you can help us get this to increase the capitalization above even 100 billion, that'd be great. Another initiative I've been working on for over a decade is putting a price on carbon, but doing it in a way that would make sure that any higher costs passed along do not hurt or burden lower income or middle income families. And the proposal was a cap and dividend. You put a cap on the first sellers of carbon intense polluting fuels into the market, and then dividend 100%. Back to consumers based on Social Security numbers. Mr. Litterman, can you just talk briefly about that approach? And if we have time, Mr. Oliver as well.
Sure, it's a great approach. The Climate Leadership Council plan also has a carbon dividend, and the beauty of the carbon dividend is it makes most people better off, in particular, those at the lower end of the income strata. So it makes sense. It's a good policy. Again, how you spend the money is up to Congress. But what's absolutely essential is to create the appropriate incentives so that the private sector gets behind this and the capital flows at the scale that we need and at the urgency we need. So absolutely, I support it.
And Senator, if I could go back and talk a little bit about the green banks. For us, we think that's a great idea. As we launch our performance contracting and our private public partnerships, it's a great way to be able to finance green projects and what we can do to upgrade infrastructure and buildings. And we have a performance contracting business, as I mentioned in my remarks, that ultimately is going to create economic returns for the work that we do to make green infrastructure while we're creating returns. And as far as the Business Roundtable does not endorse a specific market-based mechanism to reduce emissions, we do believe placing the price on carbon would send an important price signal that will help drive efficiency and spur innovation in low carbon alternatives. And there are various mechanisms that can be used. And we do believe in agreement that a comprehensive climate change policy should be guided by core principles, including preserving the competitiveness as well as effectively reducing emissions. And a price on carbon can and should be designed in a way that it supports economic growth and does not disadvantage Americans, particularly low-income Americans and those whose jobs and communities are affected by the transition to a clean energy economy.
Well, thank you. I see my time is up, but just to emphasize the point that you and Mr. Litterman made, which is actually the overwhelming majority of households actually have more money in their pocket at the end of the day if you do the 100% dividend than before. In fact, over 70% of households are better off under a University of Massachusetts Amherst study. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate all the witnesses and their participation today. Let me dive right into an urgent matter for the country, but particularly my home state of California. You know, 2020 was devastating on so many fronts, including being California's worst wildfire season on record. California experienced 10,000 fire incidents, with more than 4.2 million acres burned and more than 10,000 structures damaged or destroyed. We'll continue to have record wildfire seasons unless we take bold action to address climate change. You know, and according to the U.S. Forest Service, wildfires will be twice as destructive by 2050 as they are today. And we know wildfires are just one of the emerging climate-driven threats to our economy. Climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of various types of natural disasters and extreme weather events, which create significant risks to human health, our financial system, and entire sectors of the economy. So with that being said, question for Mr. Wallace-Wells and one for Dr. Litterman. For Mr. Wallace-Wells, Beyond the physical damage, can you elaborate on how wildfires have a devastating impact on human health and how climate change will continue? If you can just add to what you previously said, how climate change will continue to exacerbate the harm and destruction caused by wildfires and other natural disasters. And then for Dr. Litterman, a specific question about the National Flood Insurance Program, which paid out more than $1 billion in claims for the 6th year in a row. Meanwhile, flooding increased in areas known as being, quote unquote, low risk. So this is just one way that climate-driven disasters are creating a fiscal risk for the federal government specifically. And if you can discuss the need to mitigate these risks to help protect the federal budget and our economy. Mr. Waltz first.
There's basically no aspect of human health that is not damaged by small particulate pollution, which is produced by wildfires. And I think most Americans, first of all, don't truly appreciate that when forests burn, carbon is released, which means already the gains of California's ambitious clean energy proposals and policies are undone almost every year by the emissions released by those fires, but also that all those many millions of Californians who live in that state are breathing in air that affects their respiratory health, that affects Alzheimer's, it affects developmental disorders, it affects autism and ADHD, it's associated with rises in schizophrenia. You know, the effect of pollution is so intense that when we instituted Easy Pass toll plazas in America, they reduced the rates of premature birth and low birth weight right around those toll plazas by between 10 and 15%, just because people living around them weren't breathing quite as much air from the exhaust of those cars. I think this is one of the great underappreciated features of climate change and the climate impacts is the effect of air pollution. In California, there was a small-scale unintended study when there was a pollution event that forced schools to put air purifiers in their classrooms, just $700 air purifiers, and the educational gains of breathing in cleaner air was equivalent to having the class size in those classrooms. That's how horrible to cognitive performance bad air is, and the more wildfires will be burning, the more Americans will be burning that air going forward. You mentioned a doubling of wildfire. The scientists I know think that we could see 6 times as much or more by the middle of the century if we don't take action. And unfortunately, one significant way of taking action is by doing what's called prescribed burning and thinning of forests, which I think is a good idea, but also involves the burning of forests, which will also produce carbon and also produce particulate pollution. So as with many other features of the climate crisis, there isn't anymore an easy way out. We've already backed ourselves into a corner where we're choosing between worst alternatives. But I think in the American West, the pollution from wildfire will become a bigger and bigger part of our understanding of the climate crisis and a bigger argument for faster action.
Senator, I happen to be sitting here in California, and if you can see this window behind me, September 9th of last year, that was pitch black this time of day because of the smoke from the wildfires. Mm-hmm. And the insurance issue that you raise is an important one. The impacts from climate are going to be more severe over the next several decades, no matter what we do. And individuals and businesses should insure against those physical risks. The problem is that they're going to become more expensive. If you're living in the forests in California, the insurance rates are going to go up. And a free market economy, that increased rate of insurance is a signal that you either have to harden your infrastructure, your buildings, or you have to move to a safer location. And the same thing with flood insurance that you mentioned. The federal flood insurance is a subsidy to those who live in flood zones. That's not right. That gives the wrong signals, and people will respond to the signals they give. Once again, I want to emphasize how fundamental incentives are. Incentives are anything that change behavior. And so if you want to change behavior, and we do need to change behavior because of the physical risks that we've created, then you have to create the appropriate incentives. Thank you.
Thank you both. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Padilla. Let me just, as we come to a close, let me thank the 5 panelists without exception. I think your contributions were enormously important. I think there is a growing sense of understanding that in this country and around the world, we are facing an existential threat, and that is we are literally talking about the future of this planet. We're talking about whether or not we're going to have to spend trillions and trillions of dollars trying to repair the damage done by climate change. We're talking about millions and millions of people dying unnecessarily. So I hope that this hearing today makes a contribution to understanding that together we have got to act and act extremely aggressively and to act in as quickly a fashion as we possibly can. And with that, as information for all senators, questions for the records are due by 12 noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk at Dirksen 624. Email copies will also be accepted due to our current conditions. Under our rules, the witnesses will have 7 days from receipt of our questions to respond with answers. With no further business before the committee, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you all very much.